Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to untangle Europe's role in the world today.
It's changing so rapidly.
Yeah, and it's particularly fascinating now with the conflict in Ukraine, right? And with the U.S. and Russia kind of trying to figure out their own dynamic, Europe's caught right in the middle.
Yeah, and it's making them rethink a lot of things. They've depended on the U.S. for security for so long, but this conflict really brings the threat right to their doorstep. It's a tough spot to be in.
It is, and it's a good time to be having this discussion because we have some really insightful perspectives to work with today. We'll be looking at an interview with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and we also have some thoughts from the chairman of the Munich Security Conference.
It's a great mix because we get a sense of what European leaders are thinking right now, how they see their role in the world, and what they think Europe needs to do to adapt to this new reality.
So what we're going to try to do is figure out, like, what would a truly unified and influential Europe even look like? And why is it so important, especially now?
Yeah, why does it matter so much today?
Okay, so let's start by setting the scene a bit. It seems like, well, obviously, the conflict in Ukraine has really, I guess, forced Europe to look in the mirror and think about, like, what is their role in global security?
Absolutely. You can't ignore a conflict like that when it's happening right on your border.
Right.
And then you have the US and Russia talking, trying to find some kind of resolution, and European leaders are worried about being sidelined.
Yeah, like they're being left out of these really important conversations.
Exactly.
And that's something that Scholz actually addresses directly in his interview. He says, I'm sure that there will be no solution possible over the heads of the Ukrainians, meaning any solution that excludes Europe is probably not going to work.
Right.
He goes on to say, and obviously if someone wants Europe to be involved in the structures of peace in the future, it is necessary and to discuss with Europe and to implement the European leaders into this decision-making process.
So he's really emphasizing that Europe needs to be a part of the solution, not just a bystander. They want a seat at the table.
Yeah, it's like Europe is saying, hey, we're here, this affects us directly, and we need to be involved. And it's kind of a wake-up call, that they need to be more assertive and proactive on the world stage.
And that's a theme that comes up again and again, the need for a more unified and forceful European voice.
Now, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference actually had a pretty bold take on this. He said that the U.S. is basically putting pressure on Europe to step up and be more involved, and he even compared the situation to Munich in 1938, when appeasement didn't exactly work out so well.
Right. Appeasement failed to stop aggression then, and he's drawing a parallel to the situation today.
Yeah, it's a powerful comparison.
It really makes you think.
It does.
It suggests that Europe can't afford to be complacent or passive. They need to learn from history and be more assertive in defending their interests and values.
He even says, you cannot just say, I want to be at the table.
You have to bring something to the table.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, don't just expect to be included, you have to come prepared to contribute. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean for Europe to bring something to the table? What do they need to actually do to have real influence in the world?
That's the big question, isn't it? And one thing that keeps coming up in our sources is the need for Europe to invest more in defense.
That seems to be a common thread. And I was reading a statement by the Lithuanian foreign minister, and he didn't mince words.
Yeah, he was pretty correct.
He said, we need to spend on defense fast and a lot.
Hundreds of billions will need to be spent immediately.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is. He's really highlighting the scale and the urgency of the situation, and that's leading to discussions about all kinds of different ways that Europe could achieve this, like joint defense initiatives or even issuing debt together as a bloc to fund this increase.
Hundreds of billions, that's a lot of money. Where would that even come from? Is it cutting other programs or raising taxes? Or, imagine trying to balance that budget.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about strategic decision-making. What are the priorities?
Yeah.
Traditional military hardware, cybersecurity, intelligence capabilities. All of that has to be figured out.
And even beyond the money itself, is Europe even unified enough to make those kinds of big decisions? We've seen in the past how internal divisions can really paralyze the EU, right?
Right. Having a unified European voice is one thing, but making it happen, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, so it seems like we're talking about a fundamental shift in how Europe sees itself on the world stage. Not just being like a partner to the U.S., but forging its own path and having a real impact on events.
Exactly. And that brings up another big question. If Europe wants to have that kind of influence, who's going to lead the way? Is it going to be a single country or will it be some kind of partnership? I think one of the biggest hurdles they face is, well, historical baggage. Europe has a long history of internal divisions and conflicts, and those old rivalries and suspicions, they don't just vanish overnight.
It's like they're trying to build this shiny new house on a foundation that's still got some cracks in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, can they really trust each other to, have their backs if there's a crisis?
That's a great analogy. And it's not even just about trust, right? It's about each country having its own interests, its own concerns. And sometimes those clash with the idea of like a unified European approach.
So you're saying even if they want to work together, their own individual goals might get in the way.
Yeah, sometimes. Like when we're talking about defense spending, for instance, some countries are a lot more gung-ho about investing in their military than others.
Right.
And even then, there's the question of, well, what kind of military are we even building? Are we going old school with tanks and troops? Or are we focusing on things like, cyber warfare and drones? And then, of course, who gets to decide all that? It's a recipe for, some pretty heated debates.
And of course, we can't forget about, well, the elephant in the room, the U.S. I mean, for decades, Europe has relied on the U.S. for security, especially through NATO. But now they're talking about being more independent. But can they really go it alone?
That's the million-dollar question. I think a lot of people in Europe aren't so sure about how much they can actually rely on the U.S. going forward.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the last few years. There's definitely a sense that the U.S. might be turning inwards, focusing more on its own problems.
It's almost like Europe is going through this, like, awkward teenage phase. Like, they want to be independent, but they're not sure if they're ready to actually move out and, face the world on their own.
I like that. It's a coming-of-age story for a whole continent.
It really is.
And it's going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out. But one thing is clear. If Europe wants to be a major player in this century, it can't just be the U.S.'s sidekick anymore.
So we've got, historical baggage to deal with, different national interests, and this question mark hanging over the U.S.-Europe relationship. Anything else standing in the way of a truly unified Europe?
Well, there's also the whole challenge of actually making decisions. The EU it's got a bit of a reputation for being bureaucratic and slow-moving.
Committees and negotiations and compromises?
Yeah, all of that, and it takes forever to get things done.
And I imagine in a crisis that could be a real problem.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine another conflict breaks out, like what's happening in Ukraine. Europe needs to be able to respond quickly, but if they're stuck in these endless debates, well, it might be too late by the time they finally reach a consensus.
So they need to be thorough, but they also need to be agile. It's a tough balance.
It is. They can't afford to get bogged down in these drawn-out processes while the world is, changing so rapidly around them.
And there's another piece of this puzzle that we haven't even talked about yet, public opinion. Do the people of Europe actually want a more assertive, unified Europe?
That's a really good point. It's one thing for politicians and diplomats to talk about a unified Europe, but if the people aren't on board, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of different opinions about what role the EU should play in the world.
I can imagine.
Some people are very pro-European and see the EU as like this force for peace and stability, right? But others are a lot more skeptical. They're worried about losing their national sovereignty or getting dragged into conflicts they don't support.
It's a tough sell, isn't it? Like, you have to convince people that a strong and unified Europe is actually in their best interest. That it's not just some abstract political project, but something that will make their lives better, safer.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to explain the complexities of international relations or, the benefits of European integration in a way that really connects with people's everyday lives.
So it sounds like we're talking about a challenge with, all these different layers to it. It's not just about politics and military spending. It's about changing mindsets, building trust, finding a way to connect with people on a deeper level.
Right. And it's going to be a long, messy process. There are going to be setbacks, disagreements, compromises along the way. But I think it's a journey that's worth taking.
I agree. I mean, what's the alternative? A fragmented, uncertain Europe that's, increasingly vulnerable in a world that's getting more and more dangerous.
And a weak Europe doesn't just hurt Europe, it hurts the entire world.
Okay, so let's get back to this idea of bringing something to the table. What are some concrete things Europe could do to actually increase its influence on the world stage?
Well, apart from the whole defense spending thing, which we've already talked about, I think there are a couple of other areas where Europe can really play to its strengths. And one of those is diplomacy.
Diplomacy? You mean like talking and negotiating?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound very powerful in a world where everyone's, flexing their military muscles.
Maybe not as flashy as fighter jets or, cyber attacks, but diplomacy is actually one of Europe's biggest assets. They've got this long history of diplomacy and conflict resolution, and they've built this really strong network of international relationships.
You're right, they have. I mean, they did manage to bring together a whole continent after 2 world wars. That's pretty impressive when you think about it.
It is, and that experience is really valuable when it comes to dealing with global challenges like climate change, cybersecurity, things where international cooperation is absolutely essential. Europe could be a bridge builder, a facilitator, a voice of reason in a world that's becoming more and more divided.
I see your point. But isn't there a risk that focusing on diplomacy could make Europe look weak? like they're all talk and no action.
That's a valid point. That's why they have to be really smart about how they use their diplomatic tools. It's not about being passive or naive. It's about using diplomacy strategically to achieve their goals, to promote their values.
So it's like a chess game. You need to know when to make a bold move and when to be more subtle.
Exactly. And Europe has some pretty good chess players, Look at someone like Macron. He's been super active on the international stage, mediating conflicts, building relationships, really positioning France as a leader in global affairs.
And don't forget about the EU's economic power. We were talking about Schultz and how confident he is in that. But how can they use that to actually gain more influence? It's not like they can just throw money at every problem.
No, but economic power is a powerful tool when it's used strategically. Don't forget, the EU is a major trading bloc. It has a lot of leverage.
So you're saying they could use things like trade agreements and sanctions, reward their allies and punish their rivals.
Exactly. And they can also use their economic power to promote their values, things like environmental protection and labor standards, making sure that trade deals don't come at the expense of human rights, that kind of thing.
So it's not just about protecting their own interests. It's about using their power to try and shape the global economy in a way that aligns with their values.
Right, and that's something that really sets Europe apart from some of the other major powers in the world. They're not just focused on, raw power or economic dominance. They've also got this strong commitment to things like multilateralism and a rules-based international order.
So it's not just about being a big player. It's about being a responsible player. A player that's trying to create a world that's more just and more sustainable for everyone.
Exactly, and that's a message that resonates with a lot of countries, especially those that are a little bit wary of China and Russia. They see Europe as a potential counterweight, a force for stability and cooperation in a world that's becoming increasingly unpredictable.
Okay, so we've talked about diplomacy and we've talked about economic power. Anything else in Europe's toolkit?
Well, another important tool is development aid.
Oh, okay.
The EU is one of the world's biggest providers of development assistance, and they can use that strategically to promote their interests and their values in developing countries.
But doesn't that sound a little, condescending? Like Europe is just throwing money at poor countries to try to buy their influence.
It can be if it's not done right, but development aid can be a really powerful tool when it comes to promoting sustainable development, good governance, human rights, and it can also help to build stronger relationships with countries that are important to Europe strategically.
So it's about more than just writing checks. It's about building partnerships and working together to address these common challenges.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that Europe's own security and prosperity are linked to the stability and the development of the rest of the world.
It's like that old saying, no man is an island.
Exactly.
You can't isolate yourself from the world's problems and expect to be safe and prosperous forever.
Right. And I think Europe is starting to realize that. They're seeing that their own future is tied to the fate of the planet and that they have a responsibility to try to make a positive difference.
Okay, so we've been talking about all these big ideas, these complex challenges, but I want to bring it down to earth for a minute. If you were advising like a European leader right now, what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
That's a good question. I think my advice would be don't be afraid to be bold. Europe's at a crossroads, and they need to make some big choices. It's not a time for, being timid or just taking small steps. It's a time for big ideas, strategic thinking, and really courageous action.
So be bold. That's pretty good advice. I like it. But what does that actually look like in practice?
It means being willing to challenge the status quo, to break with old habits and, to take some risks. It means investing in new capabilities, finding new alliances, standing up for their values even when it's hard.
About leading, not just following.
Exactly. It's about shaping the world, not just being shaped by it.
It's about writing their own story.
Yes, and that's a story that I, for one, am very eager to read.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From the immediate challenges of the Ukraine conflict to these big, broad questions about Europe's place in the world.
And we talked about the tools that Europe can use to boost its influence, things like diplomacy, economic power, development aid, and, of course, military strength.
But I think the biggest takeaway is this. Europe has a choice to make. It can either, kind of retreat and become less and less relevant in a world that's increasingly dominated by superpowers, or it can step up, embrace its potential, and become this truly global force for good.
And that choice is going to have huge consequences, not just for Europe, but for the entire world.
Yeah, it really feels like we're at this, pivotal moment, not just for Europe, but for the whole world,
Yeah, it really does.
The decisions that they're making in Brussels and Berlin and Paris, they could really have a ripple effect across the globe.
Absolutely. What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. I mean, just think about like the implications for democracy and human rights if Europe falters. It would be a huge setback for those values worldwide.
And what about, like, the economic impact? A weak Europe, I mean, that would be bad news for everyone, right? Not just Europe.
Oh, absolutely. The EU is a massive economic force, right? Its stability and prosperity are really crucial for the whole global financial system. If Europe were to stumble, well, everyone would feel it.
Okay, so the stakes are high, we get it. But I'm still kind of stuck on this whole idea of a unified European voice. Like, it sounds good in theory, but how do they actually make that happen in the real world?
Yeah,
It's not like they could just, snap their fingers and make everyone agree on everything.
you're right. There's no quick fix for this. It's going to take time, a lot of patience, and a lot of hard work.
Hmm.
But I think there are a few things that they can really focus on to make it happen.
Okay, I'm listening. What's the roadmap here? How do you get to a more unified Europe?
Well, I think first they need to develop a much stronger sense of shared purpose.
Okay.
Right now, there's all this talk about European values, but what does that actually mean? Like in concrete terms, what are the things that every European can agree on? The core principles that like shape their vision for the future.
It's like they need like a mission statement, right?
Yeah,
A rallying cry. That's more than just, we're not Russia or we're not China.
exactly. They need to define what they stand for, what they're fighting for, what kind of world they want to build.
And how do you actually do that? Is it more meetings, more treaties?
I think it's got to go deeper than that. It's about building a sense of connection, a sense of solidarity among all the citizens of Europe,
Okay.
promoting that understanding between cultures, celebrating their diversity, and reminding everyone about, that shared history that binds them together.
So it's not just about leaders making decisions from the top down.
Right.
It's about a movement that comes from the people themselves.
Exactly. A unified Europe can't be imposed. It has to come from the people, from their shared hopes and their values.
That makes sense. So shared purpose is like the foundation. What else needs to be built on top of that?
Well, they need to come up with more effective ways of cooperating and making decisions. I mean, like we were saying before, the EU can be slow and bureaucratic. It's not always the best at dealing with crises or making tough decisions quickly.
So less red tape, more streamlined processes.
Yeah, exactly. Make the EU more agile, more responsive, but without, sacrificing democracy or consensus building.
Right. And this is where the whole question of leadership comes in, doesn't it? You need someone who can cut through all the noise, get everyone on the same page, and make those hard choices when they have to.
Yes, absolutely. That's why this debate about who's going to lead Europe is so important. It's not about personalities. It's not about national rivalries.
Hmm.
It's about finding the right people, people who can inspire and unite Europe and lead them through all this uncertainty.
So it's not just about being at the table. It's about, like, setting the table, right?
Yes,
Shaping the conversation, making sure Europe's voice is heard.
exactly. Taking charge of their own destiny, building a future that reflects what they believe in.
Now, we've talked a lot about the challenges, but I want to end on a more optimistic note. What makes you hopeful when you think about Europe's future?
Honestly, I'm optimistic about the people. They're resilient, they're adaptable, they've been through so much, and I really believe they can overcome these challenges.
It's like they've got all this experience to draw from, centuries of navigating, complex political situations, making alliances, rebuilding after conflict.
Exactly. And I'm also really optimistic about the younger generation of Europeans. They're more connected to the world than ever, and they're passionate about these big issues like climate change and social justice,
Hmm.
and they have a strong sense of what it means to be European.
They're not so hung up on the old divisions and rivalries.
Right. They see themselves as citizens of Europe, not just of their individual countries, and I think that is a powerful thing.
It really is.
That's what's going to drive Europe forward. That's how they'll reach their full potential.
Well, that's a good note to end on. The future of Europe is uncertain, but it's definitely full of possibility. And it's really up to all of us, not just the politicians and diplomats, to shape that future and make the world a better place.
Yeah, I agree.
That's it for this deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you some food for thought. Until next time, keep learning and keep diving deep.